The climate conversation has never been more divided. As disruptors in this space, we're hungry to find solutions to the challenges our environment faces. Welcome to the Climate Rebels podcast. My name is Joel Caesar. I'm joined by Owen Barrett and Chris Pomerleau. We are experts in clean energy, net zero real estate, decarbonization, and entrepreneurship. We celebrate those who take action against the climate crisis and are striving to make the world a cleaner place. Thanks for joining the conversation. Now, let's get to work. Welcome to the Climate Rebels podcast. My name is Joel Caesar, the world's greatest climate podcast host. Today, I will be hosting the show solo. My co-hosts Owen and Chris are off trying to buy real estate that we can convert to net zero energy. So they're doing the important work, and I'm here getting to talk to Ben Stapleton. So there'll be no segments or bits, but I want to give a little bit more of a personal background on the USGBC, the organization Ben represents, and that we talked a lot about today. Because I think it's really important to what we're doing in real estate and the movement of what you call green building. So at the USGBC, stands for the United States Green Building Council. They're a nonprofit that was founded in the early 90s, I think 1993. And it's been widely credited as a true market transformation tool that has attracted thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people like myself into the world of real estate, construction design, with the intent to try to use it to save the environment. And so I'll read real quickly the USGBC in their own words. Their vision is that buildings and communities will regenerate and sustain the health and vitality of all life within a generation. Their mission is to transform how buildings and communities are designed, built, and operated, enabling an environmentally and socially responsible, healthy, and prosperous environment that improves the quality of life. They're committed to transforming the built environment through LEED. That's their third-party certification of construction projects or operational buildings. It stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's the world's most preeminent green building system. Today, there are more than 105,000 LEED certified buildings in nearly 190 countries. So keeping it real here on the Climate Rebels podcast, I will say, and we talked about this on the show, the USGBC, although given enormous credit for being this market transformation tool, it's been around for 30 years. It's in the vernacular of all real estate around the world at this point, but it has its detractors. I think both on the side of people who think maybe the USGBC is a big nonprofit money grab at this point that's not actually doing enough to change things for the environment, or is it that it's just become older and outdated and it's time for these newer maybe organizations who think that green building needs to be faster and more innovative and the certification threshold needs to be higher for us to really meet the demand of the climate crisis, and that USGBC is not doing enough. So there's detractors. And I was honest to Ben in the show that I in the past might have been one of them, because I gravitated to the Living Future Institute and the Living Building Challenge as something that was further out there. I mean, they even say they want to make buildings that are good, not just less bad. But I think as Ben and I discussed in this conversation, and hopefully I can elaborate on a little bit more here, is that all of these organizations have their place. The USGBC, as the big player in green building, plays an enormous role of providing capacity and education to a wide-ranging and growing field that we're trying to attract into this field, into this profession. Ben and I talked about workforce training. It's such an important facet of what the USGBC does. All of us who know what needs to happen to decarbonize real estate in America know that it's going to be happening with physical atoms, with people doing physical work. It's going to create jobs, but we need people in those jobs, and we need people trained in those jobs to do this faster and at scale. So I give a ton of credit to people like Ben, people that get involved with the USGBC. For a long time, I was very much involved in the Los Angeles chapter. It was a really important time in my life where I met great friends, established really important professional relationships, got my feet wet in the world of green building. And so I encourage anyone who's trying to get into sustainability or green building, it's a great way to do it. Volunteer, get involved with your local USGBC chapter. And again, trying to give credit where credit's due. Ben, as someone who's in charge of the LA chapter of the USGBC, he really brings this business mindset, this entrepreneurial mindset to running a nonprofit. And it's been incredibly successful. They nurture and incubate new companies. Can't describe how important that is, especially at a regional scale, because a place like Los Angeles, it's got a unique climate, it's got unique business needs, and it's got unique new companies that are needed to help it achieve its long-term climate and sustainability goals. Workforce training. We talked a ton about that on the show with Ben, and I think it's something that we really want to make a theme of the podcast moving forward is how do we attract and train the workers of the future that are going to help us decarbonize America's real estate. And then this piece of being the North Star of a region, city like Los Angeles, it's got a proud history of design and architecture and real estate, maybe more so than any city in America, how important real estate is to its economic vitality. And to have a really thriving, strong, impactful organization like USGBC-LA that Ben is leading, and there's so many important volunteers are involved in driving and shepherding, being the beacon of hope within that region, within that city, to say, look, we want to maintain this proud tradition of design and real estate in Los Angeles, but there's a better way to do it. And not only does the climate crisis demand it, but the climate change is happening. And if we're not adapting to that in places like Los Angeles and Southern California, then those investments in that real estate are never going to come to fruition because we're just not going to be able to adapt to this changing future. So I learned a lot from Ben, as I always did on this show. He's a breath of fresh air that combines this realistic perspective of what it's going to take and how businesses operate and how we need to be entrepreneurial, but then also hopeful and optimistic and a dreamer about what's possible. So I learned a lot. I think you all will too. And, we talked a little bit about how Ben is leading a nonprofit and how that's so important in a way to incorporate into this show, as we're trying to we're trying to talk a lot about entrepreneurs and people taking action and disrupting, but you can do that through nonprofits, as Ben has done and as Chad Nelson has done with the Surfrider Foundation from our last show. So lots to learn from the episode. Are you new to green building and sustainability and you're looking to learn how to get involved? We got you on the show. Are you an expert or an entrepreneur looking for ways to scale your business or find new opportunities? You can learn that here too. So we hope you enjoy it. I know I did. And now let's jump into our conversation with Ben Stapleton. Ben Stapleton is an LA native who brings a creative mind and consultative approach to a wide range of projects with a focus on building teams and designing programs to deliver impactful results. His current work is based on coordinating an ecosystem, leveraging the built environment as the entry point and connective fabric to help create a more sustainable society for all, as executive director for the U.S. Green Building Council of Los Angeles. In his time at USGBC-LA, he has strengthened the foundation of his leading membership-based sustainability organization while creating a team culture and developing a portfolio of community engagement and education-focused programming centered on climate justice, high-performance buildings, occupant health, corporate sustainability, and regional resilience, establishing talent development and a people-first philosophy as the pillars of the brand. He's been the recipient of numerous national awards and is a recognized thought leader in the sustainability space. So, Ben, welcome to the Climate Rebels podcast.
Thank you, Joel. Good to see you. Everybody always loves having their bio read. Be in front of them. It's the best. It's the best.
I'm sure, especially when it's an impressive one like yours.
I'm being facetious, but yeah, no, it's good. It's good to see you. It's good to see you.
You too. It's good to have you here. We're excited. Well, I know you're a fan of the show, so I won't ask you that question. But if you are, we start every show with the same question. We get to right to work here. So, Ben, how are you a climate rebel?
It's a good question. Well, I feel like for me, I'm a business person first in my career that's come to run nonprofits now for the last, I feel like I'm starting to get old, the last decade and change. And so I feel like in my own world that definitely sort of makes me come with a different mindset, different approach to the work that I do. I've now been part of starting and really redefining kind of 3 different nonprofits in the sustainability space, and kind of look at myself as a little bit of a environmental entrepreneur for what it's worth. I'm a big believer that we need to be constantly figuring out how we shake up the system. So I think with the programs that we create, we're trying to find ways to add value, to connect the dots and accelerate our collective work in ways that we can make an impact against climate change. We don't have the benefit of waiting around or just relying on what we're doing now to continue to make the impact that we want to see. And so I think we need to continue to shake things up and I guess like it sort of says in my bio, figure out how we lead more with people first, right? I think we tend to leave people out of the equation in as much as we think we're including them a lot of the time.
Well, it's an interesting it's a consistent theme we've heard from other leaders like yourself that we've had on the show, is this people first language that sustainability is probably not good at using. So we welcome it here. And another interesting piece I thought about as I was preparing for you to be on, interestingly enough, as we thought about launching this podcast, in a large way, it's behind this brand that we're building. It's an entrepreneurial real estate fund, and it's got crowdfunding. So we thought the podcast would be this cool mechanism to introduce ourselves and speak in a way that is represents our brand. And we really wanted to have guests on the show. We wanted to slant towards entrepreneurs, doers, people taking action. And you will be the second guest 2 weeks in a row, a leader of a nonprofit. And I didn't really hesitate to book either you or Chad Nelson, who was the previous guest, the CEO of the Surfrider Foundation. Maybe it's because those are two organizations I know very well, Surfrider LA and Surfrider in general, and the USGBC-LA chapter. You and I will talk about. I spent a lot of times volunteering there. But I also know, as you just described, that there is an entrepreneurial necessity to running these nonprofits and doing them well, as I'm sure you're going to tell us all about. It's interesting how you just described yourself, environmental entrepreneur, shaking up the system. Those are language that we associate with startup, entrepreneur, business. So lot to unpack. I really, maybe to start right there. Business approach to running a nonprofit. Well, actually, I don't want to go there yet. Maybe I should let you tell me what you do first. Let's learn about your current role, and then we can dive further into your mindset in running it.
Yeah, so I think part of the best way to answer that question for me is really to kind of go back to why I got into this work. I wrote my entrance exam or essay for business school, like most people do, but I wrote it about businesses that created positive social change because of how their business models were designed, right? And today that would be called social entrepreneurship or impact investing. At the time, there wasn't really a label for that. And I think, that's really part of how our system needs to evolve. You and I have talked about this and, the work that you're doing over at Raven. But, we need to really redefine the business model for real estate, right? The real estate business model hasn't taken into account all these factors around occupant health or these factors around long-term impacts to the environment, whether it's, through different kinds of carbon or environmental impacts. And then the model's flawed. And like so much of our system uses these financial models that we take into account that they're accurate and that they're basis for everything. But the reality is that just like us as people, right, they've got flaws, and we need to continue to think about how do we get them to better reflect, kind of the world and the model around it. So in my work here at USGBC-LA, we're an independent nonprofit. Our mission is really to leverage the built environment as an entry point to transform Southern California into a more sustainable region for all. And so we have a portfolio of about 13 different programs now that we've created, all of them really over the last 3 or 4 years, really focused on direct community engagement, on education, trying to find ways to one of the things I love about buildings, I'm a sustainability generalist, but I'm a green building nerd at heart, is that buildings touch everything, right? Whether it's energy, water, waste, health, and one of the things I love about the green building community is the green building community is such a centralized touch point we can use that we can create positive impacts that there's a structure for, that we can figure out the returns on, and that are tangible, that can have these positive ripple impacts right across the rest of society. And so I think that's the opportunity with buildings, and that's why I work in buildings, at the end of the day.
Well, I want to learn all about this specifics of your efforts at USGBC-LA. I know you've taken a very innovative approach to running the chapter, the nonprofit, but you're a green building nerd. I'm a green building nerd, but let's pause for some education to the audience. USGBC, maybe we take a step back. What is it? How long has it been around? What was its mission? And then how does that turn into the Los Angeles chapter that you run?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, the U.S. Green Building Council that runs the LEED credential and certification that many folks are aware of, Really started, I want to say, the mid to late 90s. I don't know if I know the exact date for their organization. And that's, leadership and environmental engineering and
It's
design.
93.
It was 93. There you go. I was close.
Yeah,
That's good news.
I looked it up this morning. 30-year
Yeah.
anniversary.
um, and, USGBC-LA, we're an independent nonprofit. We started in 2002, really by a community of green building folks who wanted to see how they could, take some of that approach to looking at buildings and create more positive impacts right here in the greater LA region. I think, while USGBC as an organization has continued to be more and more focused on, that lead credential and certification, which is, the globally leading basis, I think, for how folks tend to approach green buildings. Our organization is really focused on community engagement, and that's a difference, right? That's a conceptual, philosophical difference. We have an independent board. We're independent financially. Frankly, I took this role after helping to start and grow another pretty sizable nonprofit, the LA Clean Tech Incubator, because I am a green building nerd, and I saw the opportunity to really unify the green building community here in the region. And I kind of felt like at the time we had sort of devolved a little bit into this argument over which certification was best, and we didn't really have a vision on where we were going around buildings. And to me, that was like really beside the point. We have so much progress that we need to make, and buildings give us such a great entry point that we really need to get organized and unify and come together to be effective. And frankly, I think we've done a good job of that over the past few years in the LA region. And now I'm starting to think about California and beyond. How do we unify in a bigger way? Because we don't have the luxury of just kind of sitting aside. We really need to figure out how we can make these impacts happen faster.
Well, I appreciate the background. I'll be totally transparent too. I in my career in green building, I'd say I probably really started diving in like 2008, 2009. I was not working in what you'd call sustainability at the time. I was in the financial services. I worked for AIG. I was doing environmental insurance underwriting, but I kept seeing lead come across my desk on these huge real estate transactions that required environmental insurance, referencing this thing called lead. And I was a idealist in my 20s, working in a Los Angeles cube and not really thinking what I was doing for AIG was saving the world. And I started volunteering with USGBC-LA. I was like, oh, let's figure out what this lead thing is and let's get into the mix and start meeting people. And I would say the chapter involvement changed my life. I started getting involved a little bit with USGBC-LA, and I was like, oh yeah, this is a cool group of people trying to do things differently. Approaching Los Angeles as a region very specifically because of the opportunity it presents. And I just made a choice. Okay, I'm done with what I was doing. I'm going to go to grad school. I'm going to do green building. So been doing it for 15 years. And I think early on, I was very pro USGBC. I got my lead AP in 2009. I mean, I was as gung-ho, lead is the thing. USGBC is this organization I'm going to rally around. And then I think like a lot of people, like you just described, there became over the last 5 to 10 years, this notion of, well, is USGBC doing enough? And is LEED ambitious enough for the climate crisis? These other certifications, these other third-party certifications that came out to compete against it, are they better? Are they different in a way that should be considered for various niche type of projects? So all that to be said, I definitely over times have questioned the value of USGBC. And I'm sure you come on my podcast, I'm sure that's not what you want the host to say, but I'm going to make a point here to say, I've come full circle, and especially on the chapter and what you guys are doing in LA, because like sustainability, climate, these conversations, such a theme of our show is it's so big, it's esoteric. How do I help? It seems unfathomable how this person in my community is going to do anything to stop this, this devastation that's coming with the climate crisis. But you have to act local. I mean, it's cliche, but right. Think global, act local, and things like USGBC-LA and what you've done enables that. This, like you just, I mean, I wanted to learn all about it here too, especially the Clean Tech Incubator, because what you're doing in LA is combining this incubation of young companies and young entrepreneurs. Super, super important at a regional city scale. You're doing workforce training, as you and I both know. What needs to happen to decarbonize real estate in America and around the world, we don't have enough manpower to do it. We can't train enough people to get into this field. And then I think the piece of having the events and the celebratory moments that you shepherd as a way to bring the Los Angeles community together. And I'm sure you'll say, like, right, it's happening lots of places around the world. I live in New York now. There's a really strong USGBC New York chapter. That's really important, getting people together to ensure that we're all speaking the right language and we're acknowledging the efforts it takes to do this the right way. So, long way of saying USGBC-LA, I'm a fan. I know you are, but tell me, when you got into this, how did you want to approach things differently?
That's a really good question, and I think what I've come to realize, kind of what you were talking about, right? Like climate change is such an overwhelming thing. Like we're just simple human beings. We can't actually contemplate, what that means to us or how we can have an impact on that. And I've been doing this work now probably since 2007, in some shape or form. So roughly kind of the same timeline, as you and uh, I used to, I go to these events and you hear, folks talk about, oh, sustainability, we got to do this, we got to do that when you're at the green events. And you go to these real estate events and literally, I used to say maybe 1% of the people cared in the room. And now there's 5 to 10% of the people who actually care in the room. Um, I think part of why I came here is because I felt like we need to humanize this experience. Like I always ask people when I speak at general real estate events now, I say, hey, who here feels like they've experienced the impacts of climate change in the last few years? Because you do that 5-10 years ago, and nobody would be like, oh, like I don't even know what that is. I don't know if it's real. And now everyone can point to the fact that like, hey, I have dealt with the impacts of wildfire, or a friend of mine lost a home, or a family member, or hey, yeah, I can't water my lawn, more than one day a week, and it died, or whatever it might be, and these are simple, tangible things that people are dealing with, but these are the impacts of climate change. And the fact is that it sort of resonates with everyone now. And to your point, as human beings, if we can't comprehend something or comprehend our place in it, we're not going to do anything about it, right? We don't know what to do to make progress. But I do think that this movement around empowering people with the spaces that they occupy, the spaces they control, it's not just your decisions about having a composter right in your kitchen on your tabletop. That's great. Your decisions about water, your decisions about things that you procure, all those things help. But you have to learn about how to approach those, and it all starts with education. Because I think once you teach people and open their eyes about using green cleaning products, like the benefit of having natural light and better ventilation, all these things that we take into account as green building principles, people don't unlearn those things. They don't stop thinking about them, and we just need to lead with those pieces first. Because at the end of the day, sustainability is really about health, right? It's really about having a quality of life, and maintaining that. And coming back to kind of like why I got into this or how I want to approach things differently, I really wanted to build community and figure out how do we meet people where they're at, and really have education that can embrace everyone as part of that process, so they can be part of it. And that's why we have our Green Janitors education program here that really works with janitors and empowers them, that they're the ones who actually decide if the building operates green or not at the end of the day. We've launched this native plant landscaping classes over the last couple of years to work with gardeners and landscapers and teach them how to use native plants the right way. And just seeing the power of that to be transformative for people who've been doing gardening for 20 years and learning these new things is pretty mind-blowing. We just launched some wildfire defense classes last year, which, it's a 3-hour course for construction folks or for landscapers. And we almost have 400 people now who got certified and graduated from that. And it's just education first of like, these are things that you can do to have an impact in the work that you do. People really grab onto that and they feel empowered and they want to make the right decisions, right? And so to me, that's part of what I wanted to do when coming here, was kind of bring that real people first engagement, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. And I often, I'm sure you do too, I get pinged a lot, LinkedIn or various other channels. People get my contact information, young people saying, hey, I see your career. I'm a college student interested in sustainability, or I'm going to college and I want to study environmental science, and would just love to learn about advice you might have, or how I can potentially help people on their career path. And maybe it's just because I spent most of my career, you said sustainability generalist with a as a green building nerd. That's a good way I'm going to steal that because I'm sort of the same.
It
I
is
always lean
trademarked,
back into
Joel.
green.
Just so you know, it's trademarked, so it's cool. But
I'll acknowledge you. It's okay. Interesting enough, you said earlier that you basically invented social entrepreneurship. So I think maybe I should give you credit for that too.
I didn't say that. I did not say that. Yeah.
Well, but I always come back to green building, and maybe this is just because my network and the people I know, but I'm usually like, get into green building consulting. It's a place that's usually hiring. The LEED certification system, lots of major real estate companies or anybody who owns real estate probably has to certify their buildings for LEED certification. And so there's always consulting opportunities. And my advice to people is, look, even if you don't care about construction, real estate design, never did, if you get into green building and learn about sustainability as that to be, I'll use another term from you here, the entry point into your perspective on business and sustainability, it's a really great foundation. I mean, obviously real estate touches so many different things. I mean, that's another been theme of the show is just how real estate is so important to the climate crisis because it's such a massive industry. But I think the educational part and the way you take that with you into your lives, into your home life, into your family life, into your community life. I mean, like you said, you can't unlearn. I to this day argue with my in-laws about opening the windows because I'm like, my kids are here. I want them to see the trees outside. That's important. I know that's important. And you talked about green cleaning. One of the first jobs I had in green building, I was an intern on a green building project in Santa Barbara while I was in grad school there. And the general contractor asked me to take control of the green cleaning credit. So I had to learn about why USGBC thinks green cleaning is important and what protocols we're going to have to put in place to achieve the credit. And to this day, will never buy cleaning products the same because of that process. So I guess I'm just really affirming everything you just said about green building and why that's the right entry point and everything you're trying to do at USGBC-LA. But let's take it a step further with the work you're doing there. You talk about shaking up the system, something I took note of here. Tell us how you're approaching that in LA. That's the clean tech incubator. You just described the wildfire. I mean, is it just almost with your business hat on, this entrepreneurial taking, I mean, advantage isn't the right word for wildfire training, but I guess acknowledging that's something that people have paying attention to. And therefore that's an opportunity for you to build capacity in the chapter. But yeah, tell us how you're innovating, how you're doing this differently.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think I think part of it is trying to be aware of where there's a gap, right? I take the wildfire piece as an example. My eyes were really opened when I learned just a lot of things you can do that are cost neutral or low cost to reduce wildfire risk. At the end of the day, we always say embers are what cause homes to burn and fires. It's not the fire itself, right? It's the fact that our homes have materials or design flaws that are catching these embers and haven't been hardened, to reduce that risk. And so I found that there just wasn't a business community really advocating for it. And so we stepped in and said, hey, we've got this green building community that's doing all this stuff about sustainability. People get their LEED certification, right? Other certifications so they can grow their business, right? So they can sell to their clients. Why not enable and empower the construction professional, the landscaper to learn these same things so that when they're pitching business to a customer or bidding on a contract or even talking to just a client, they can say, look, I've been wildfire defense certified. You can do these things to reduce wildfire risk. I think the homeowner is going to choose someone if they're interviewing a contractor to do a remodel in their house. They're going to choose someone who says, hey, I know how to protect your home. You're in a wildfire area versus someone who doesn't. And so rather than forcing people to sort of, yes, we need the carrot and the stick, right? We need the stick that requires people to do the right things. But if we also empower people to take a little bit more of that control in their own hands and figure out how they can make more money by getting more educated and doing the right thing, people want to do that, right? So that's an example with wildfire. Same thing with native plants. Like, again, my eyes were just so opened, native plants, they take less water. They require virtually no pesticides, right? If you do them the right way. They really, help support our local, insect populations and bird populations and all these things. It's hitting all these boxes, right? But the reality is, the normal gardeners, you think if you think about your mow and blow gardeners that come to your street, do they ever get education really around a lot of these things? No one's reaching out to them to try to say, hey, did you know if you did X, Y, and Z, it's better for your health, right? That if you're not having to use pesticides. And by the way, there's programs to replace that blower on your back that's using diesel, right, with something that's electric. So if they know those things, they're going to make the choices that are better for them, but we need to really put them first. And so, yes, there's a business component of that because we're seeing a niche and a gap that we can fill. We're trying to connect the dots and structure that. But I think a lot of that is seeing where you can add value. And if you can see a place where you can add value, then you think about, okay, what's the business model, to monetize that and to create that impact. And what does that look like, right? And so, we've been working hard on building out our workforce development and training capacity here. Where we're having at least one, maybe two classes a week now on a variety of different things. I'm trying to find funding right now to do a similar certification around extreme heat that we've done for wildfire, where you're looking at, helping construction professionals learn how to use materials, insulation, shading, things like that are going to reduce heat impacts so that the next 10, 20 years when they're doing work, right, they're figuring out how to do that. So, in my time here, we run a net zero accelerator for startups. We bring on about 15 to 20 startups a year from all around the world that we think can make an impact in Southern California around net zero energy, water, waste. That really kind of came out of my work at the LA Clean Tech Incubator, where we worked with probably close to 100 startups in my time there. And the funny thing about when you get into these startups and these different companies is that you realize, yes, there's a business model and there's a technology there, but at the end of the day, it's still about the people, right? Are those people going to be able to communicate to someone else what the value is? And a lot of things that we focus on in our accelerator is really around storytelling, and how do you build that relationship to place a pilot and do the right kind of pilot that can scale? It may not be a surprise, but technologies and buildings fail to excite people a lot of the time, right? So you have to be able to tell a story that gets people excited, and because there is an excitement level there. And so I guess the point I'm trying to make is it's about how do you communicate value and connect with people. That's kind of a central theme throughout all of this, right? Because that's going to create the change. And I could talk a little bit more about disrupting and kind of what that looks like, because I think that's, we're in this space right now where there's all this federal investment and this focus, I think, on buildings in a way we've never had before, right? Where, there's money coming down the pipeline here. We've got the IRA and we've got the Build Back Better, we've got all these things. I think we're dramatically underestimating what's needed to prepare the market and to get people ready to move a lot of that forward in a way that's going to have the kind of impacts we want. And I think those of us who are kind of in this green building world assume like, oh, well, it's going to make sense. It's this and that. And like, it's just the systems are not set up and we don't have like just, the electrical contractors, right, to do the work. There's so much that needs to be done to kind of elevate the market. And that's the place where I think, frankly, those of us in this community need to own things a little bit more right now and say, look, yes, we're getting funding and all these things that are setting things up for more success maybe than ever before. And now's the time when we actually need to step up and say, hey, I know, what these things look like, or maybe how to implement electrification through this type of building, or how to, do X, Y, or Z. And now's the time to really build more of the market to get ready for that, right?
It's so well said, the term step up. And you mentioned electrification and electricians. I got a buddy who's in recruiting, and he's got his own company, and he's always asking me, we're always just talking about business and what's the future. And he said to me, this is someone, again, to your point about businesses and the evolution of climate change and sustainability. This is a person who I would say doesn't necessarily care, wouldn't call himself an environmentalist, but knows that I'm in this field and is hearing it more and more, and has asked me, hey, in my recruiting business, what should I be thinking about based on your world? And I didn't even hesitate. I said, electricians. We don't have enough electricians. We have so much electrification work to do. There's going to be so much money. There's going to be so much demand. I'm seeing it in my experience at Google. We're trying to do this across the world in commercial office buildings. And that's Google. That's huge commercial. That's big companies we're working with. And even there, we're seeing some capacity, headcount, workforce challenges. So imagine scaling that to what we need to do at the residential scale. So it's interesting too when you talk about step up and the green building community and where the rubber meets the road. And I'm going to give you a ton of credit here, and USGBC-LA and organizations like USGBC-LA, because when people look around, I'm like, okay, I'm running building electrification at Google. That's a big, important job. I'm really excited about trying to get there by 2030, electrify all our buildings. But we really need electricians, and hopefully someone's working on that. And it's like, okay, well, here's the guy, Ben Stapleton and USGBC-LA. They're working on it. But how do we help? Is there a message here from the podcast that we can get out and tell people we need more soldiers?
We do need more soldiers. I think. Look, I think even what you just said, right, about talking to your in-laws on some level about opening the windows, right, and taking the time to do that is kind of part of the messaging. I think also we need to talk to each other in the space. Like, I can't tell you how many of these sustainability conferences I go to where you've got architects that are up there talking about, oh, well, we have to electrify everything. I don't understand why everyone's doing this, and you're like, okay. And then I go and I talk to them and I'll be like, so have you tried electrifying your home? Oh, well, no. And I'm like, okay, well, have you talked to someone who has? So if you talk to people who have, you literally, people who have tried to do this, they're getting into arguments with the people who are the contractors to try to convince them to do a heat pump installation or convince them to do X, Y, or
True.
Z.
Yeah.
And I just think we have this disconnect where, like, and I'm not trying to harp on electrification, but we think there's a sort of panacea that's just going to solve all of our problems. And reality is there's all these things that are connected to that. And so the step up on our part, I think, is to educate and to be aware. And for those of us that are leaders, whether it's at Google or at other companies, to acknowledge that, like, we have the money and the resources and the privilege to be able to do X, Y, and Z. But the reality is, 98% of the market or whatever number we want to use doesn't have that. And so how do we communicate that that is where the need is, right? When we're designing a building that's net positive and it's got all the bells and whistles and it's checking all the boxes, that's great. But we also need to acknowledge that, that's a lighthouse, right? That's pointing the way. But much of the rest of the world is in kind of the darkness, right? And trying to figure out how do we get to a more resilient future. So how do we use this as an example that can scale, as opposed to patting ourselves on the back and saying, oh, well, look at this great thing that we did. It's like, hey, we did that and that was awesome. How do we figure out how to get that out to help other people, right? If that makes sense. And so that's where I think we need to step up as a community, because I think a lot of us are feeling good. Like, hey, ESG is a thing now and investors care and that's great. But that still just means we have the opportunity to do more work and to have a greater impact if we position things the right way,
I share your perspective about this dialogue we hear at green building conferences specifically, and patting ourselves on the back and feeling like things are good and ESG is now in the mainstream and we've never had a seat at the table in the C-suite like we've had before. We made it. We did it. Green building, sustainability. Now everyone just has to execute. But we talked about my business partners who are usually hosting the show with me. We're starting a company called Raven because it was like, yeah, everyone's talking, but there is millions of buildings across this country that need to be decarbonized, and someone's got to go take action on them. So we said, let's create a business. Let's try to build capacity. Let's try to crowdfund a real estate fund, and let's get out there and start decarbonizing buildings, because we're tired of talk. We're tired of patting ourselves on the back. We want action. We want action at scale. We want action immediately. And we think there's a lot of people who agree and are frustrated with inaction. But all goes back to another point you made here about communication. So there's a question you helped me tee up here for our show. I'm gonna read it out loud because I think it's so well said. You kind of just touched on it a little bit, but I'm gonna ask you the question you wanted me to ask you here. You said, humanizing the green building movement. Too many people are just trying to make themselves feel better instead of creating lasting change. How can people get involved? So tell us, what's the message to deliver here?
Well, for me, the humanization is kind of about two things. I think one, around kind of what we were talking about earlier, just around climate change sort of being overwhelming. And, I would do this kind of talk during COVID where I would show like the COVID numbers, right? And everyone was checking the graphs all the time. And then I would show, the CO2 numbers, right? And how we check that graph all the time. And like, we think by looking at those graphs that like we've got some sort of basis of like what's happening and that we've got some control. But the reality is that we don't really know necessarily what's happening, and that, struggle is part of being human. And for a lot of us, like, one of the things I love about America is like we're all immigrants on some level. It was coming to a place where you could get a steady job and a home and a paycheck. And, maybe the challenge of our lifetime is that we got to experience the world as it was, and we get the sort of responsibility of trying to shepherd it into whatever it becomes. And it's going to be struggle. Like, as much as I'm an optimist, like, climate change is already here. It's already happening. The impacts are going to become greater. That's going to be our struggle. The humanization is, making friends, right, along the journey, celebrating the successes that we do have, and creating that joy, because it is going to be a struggle. And what we don't want to do is get burned out, get pessimistic, and feel like it's over. Like, we need to maintain that optimism to maintain the fight, to maintain the struggle, because that's part of this reality. And why I say that is because I meet with a lot of young people. I'm sure you do too. We have an intern program. We bring on about 15 to 20 interns every 6 months that we are either unemployed or underemployed, looking for careers and sustainability, and they work for us. We place them with employers. You hear from them. So many of them are so, sort of depressed and pessimistic about the future of the world, right? And I think we need to kind of own that collectively, to say, hey, struggle is just part of being human, but it's okay. We're going to be in it together, right? And we're going to be able to be here, and you're still going to have a life and be able to form relationships, but it's going to feel and look different. And that's just part of the story of what it's been to be human. So that's where the humanization comes in for me. I think coming back to the communicating and, what do people need to do to sort of step up? I think it's meeting people where they're at, right? Like, having that conversation with your gardener to say, like, hey, what do you know? Do you know anything about native plants? Like, should you be using this diesel like lawnmower? Like, and that's okay. Like, don't make them feel bad. That's just what people know. Maybe there's a better alternative. And even like when we get into this electrification conversation, it's like, well, some people are like, we got to do all this or nothing. And it's like, well, hey, we need to meet people where we're at and make progress. Like, if someone isn't going to completely put in a new heat pump and an EV charger and do all the stuff, well, it's like, hey, what can they do, right? How can you help educate them and help them figure out a plan for the next 5 to 10 years of their life, or their building's life, or even the developer that you're working with, right? Like, we have a program that we're running called Green Homes LA, where we're working with owners and managers of buildings and low-income communities. We have funding to install one heat pump. And some people are like, why would you do that? And I was like, I just want them to be comfortable with replacing one of their units with heat pumps so they can get to know it. The reality is they're going to be mandated to do a lot of this stuff in the next 5 to 10 years. But those people who get that experience early on with that transition, they feel comfortable with it, they're going to make that switch much faster than someone else. And so I guess the call to action is really to be a little bit more aware and meet people where they're at. It doesn't mean we don't stop pushing for the change. It means that we accept people for who they are and where they're at, and say, okay, how can we move forward together, right? In a way that maybe that's education, maybe that's resources, maybe that's just sharing with your in-laws about opening a window from time to time so your kids can get some fresh air, whatever it might be. And that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah. So I still own a home in Los Angeles. That's where you and I met. It's where I spent most of my adult life. I love the city. I'm bullish on it long term. That's why I kept my property there. I bought it near USC. It's in the Jefferson Park neighborhood. It's an old 1911 Craftsman. It was an abandoned site when I bought it. The landscaping, it smelled like garbage. It was really in rough shape. I spent the year and a half I lived there re-landscaping it myself. And I'm not an expert at all, but I worked at the city of Santa Monica and in the Office of Sustainability. It's a proud organization and community in Santa Monica for drought tolerant native landscaping. In a lot of ways, it's one of the national leaders, and especially in climates like Los Angeles, Southern California. So I had that experience as I was moving into this home, and had a lot of conversations with landscapers or potential landscapers about what I was trying to do, what I wanted to do. And it was fascinating. I mean, to your point, meeting people where they are, and people want to do the right thing and want to learn. So I don't know what the call to action here, but I guess if you're a green building person listening to this, we need as much of us out there doing this in our communities, in our homes, communicating with people that are on the front lines of building and repairing and maintaining buildings and properties, because that's where, like another term you use here, we got to be shepherds. It's so fascinating. I'm thinking so much in this conversation about, you have these moments in your career, I'm sure you do too. It's like, in Santa Monica, I got to be a part of building one of the world's greenest buildings. This crazy, fancy science project of a building. It's a great
project. It's a great project.
It is. I hope people go see it if they're in Los Angeles. But part of me thinks, okay, like you said, that's a lighthouse. That's great. That's important. We need those. But maybe I'd be better off spending my life trying to work with people in Los Angeles to make their landscaping drought tolerant. Like, that'd be more impact. But I think that's the opportunity we have in the field of green building, because it is, although it's niche, it's growing, and it can be really large, right? All buildings should be green building as we move forward. And I'll just say thank you to the USGBC-LA. Thank you to people like yourself, Ben, thinking innovatively, getting into the weeds with the community, workforce training, business incubation. It's so important. So thank you for the work you do.
Thank you, man. I really appreciate that. And, you know, if there's anything that we can distill down from this message, I think it's to be conscious of spending so much time talking to each other, right? Which is important, right? We need to push each other forward, but also maybe taking that same amount of time to talk to those that maybe don't have access to the same information or don't believe the same way we do. And that could be in the real estate space. I guarantee you there's the majority by far of the real estate market who doesn't understand yet these things and how to do them and think they're important. Or it could just be, to your point, your gardener, right? Or your family member or your friend. And that's I think the call to action,
yeah.
you know?
Or the HVAC company that you hire to come and think about, do you do a mini split or do you do central air or do you do a boiler? I mean, those of us who are sustainability geeks probably drive those contractors crazy, but we need to have those conversations.
That's right. And it's not easy, right? It's makes things harder sometimes, but I always think it's funny. Like we think as people, like the reason we exist at this level is because we can communicate, but the thing that we're the worst at is communication, right? It's kind of like both sides.
Well, I mean, we're running out of time here, but I'll catch up with you, as we see each other on the green building circuit. But even with Raven, our company, we were probably naive thinking we're trying to buy existing buildings and convert them to net zero, and we're going to give investors 10% to invest with us. This is going to be a slam dunk, no brainer. As soon as we launch the website, investment's going to start pouring in. Turns out that's not how it works, and this is going to be a little harder. And telling our story is going to take nuance, and communication is difficult. And we're learning a lot. I'm sure you've learned a lot in your career. I think in general, as you described, sustainability professionals need to continue to sharpen that knife, is the communication side, because it's critical.
Yeah, and we always got to be focused on learning, right? That's the part of why we keep working. I think is to always keep learning. And look, when in our startup accelerator, it's funny because I have these discussions with startup founders all the time, right? And they're like, "Oh, well, this technology is amazing. It's going to do X, Y, and Z." And I'm like, "That's great. I'm not saying it's not great. I'm saying that if you can't talk to someone so that they understand and care enough that they're actually going to put the money into it, it doesn't matter." Right? Like and I think that's the challenge. And that's why when we work with a lot of these entrepreneurs, it's like, hey, you got to really put yourself in the other person's, shoes, figure out what matters to them and what's the path that they're walking. Because at the end of the day, you could have the best widget that's going to save the world since sliced bread. But if somebody can't understand that and feel emotionally connected to it, they're not going to buy it. They're not going to put it in their building. They're not going to do it, because people buy on emotional decisions, right? People buy on these things it's about the money is important, but it's only if they feel good about it, right? So I think that's something that we need to continue to think about. And that's why we bang our heads against the wall, right? For so long, we were like, hey, green building's the right thing to do. How could you not do it? And then it was like, okay, well, we need to go back and sharpen our pencils, right? We need to figure out how the numbers make sense, because that's how society works. And then people will feel good about it, right? So we're still figuring that out, but that's okay, right? That's all part of the journey.
Yeah. It's so true. Talking about the numbers too. It's been a great experience for me. I've worked at Santa Monica. I've worked at Skanska. I've worked for a green building consulting company in London. I've worked now at Google. I'm in these bubbles of privilege, as you described. Like these places that the bar is really high to achieve impact for sustainability, and it's expected. But that's not the average. That's not the 98% of our experience in this global economy. And this company I started on the side, it's been years of business partners and I trying to buy apartment buildings and do this. And now we're doing it through Raven. But it's trying to buy Class B, Class C apartment buildings in tertiary cities and add renewable energy and energy efficiency to them and still meet the demands of our investors has been a real wake-up call to me, as someone who's been at the conferences and been in the conversations the same as you and been like, this is so obvious. Why isn't everyone doing this? It saves money in the long term. You do a net present value with this discount rate, then it's like, that's not how people make decisions. That's not how investors who want their 18% IRR and want their money back in 5 years, they're going to say, well, if your solar does that, great. If it doesn't, then find another business model. So I think you and I agree here. The green building movement I think we need to get in touch with reality as much as we can for, how decisions actually get made.
And I don't want to discount how far we've come, right? And there was a great report that was released by 2030 a little bit ago, just how much better buildings have gotten, right, from a design standpoint and embodied carbon standpoint. Like, look, we're making progress. This is not to discount what we've done so far, but this is to say, like, hey, now's when we really need to dig in that much more. And, to your point, like, be honest with ourselves and say, how do we engage the rest of the world, right? Because I guarantee you, I bet in those Class B and Class C buildings in those tertiary markets, right, you're dealing with permitting officials for people who don't care. You're dealing with sellers who don't really care that you've got this new special business model that's going to be so much better. At the end of the day, they still have to believe and feel that emotional attachment and feel that it means something, right? Otherwise, they're not going to help you on your journey either, right? And we're at this point too, where look, we're seeing those impacts more and more from heat and water scarcity and everything else. We continue to risk going into this place where we've got kind of the part of the world that's sort of ready and moving in the right direction, and part of the world that's so kind of woefully far behind. And we need to start figuring out how we bridge that gap. Otherwise, that's just going to continue, and that's what's going to cause the strife that none of us want to deal with, right, in our lifetimes, right?
Yeah. Well, it's a good segue. We're going to wrap it up on our last question. You talked struggle. Look, let's be real. There is struggle. This is going to get hard. The climate is changing, especially in places like Los Angeles that are very hot and have water scarcity issues. So that's real. Let's acknowledge that. But here on the Climate Rebels podcast, we try to stay optimistic. We try to celebrate the doers who are taking action. And we like to end the conversations on optimism. So, Ben, what gives you hope for the future?
It's people, man. I mentioned our Green Building Corps program where, we're bringing on about 15 to 20 of these folks who are unemployed or trying to have careers in this industry. And they are smart, they are driven. They're not going to be held back. And I think what gives me hope is the people that are coming behind us who are better prepared, have a better foundation of knowledge probably than we ever had to go into this space, and are also thinking about how to disrupt the market and are looking at what we did as those were kid games, right? And how do we level that up in a bigger way? And so that's what gives me hope, right? Is that there's people who are even more inspired that are coming, sort of behind us that we can work with, in the years to come. And also I do take hope, and I know people are talking about it just being greenwashing and this and that with the ESG movement, all those sorts of things. But the reality is that we are making progress there, and the people are caring, and that if things like climate risk disclosure do get passed and public companies see a major adjustment in how they're valued, like, that gives me hope that we're going to continue to push things in the right direction. So I'm hopeful, as much as I may have come across as maybe pessimistic today. I'm an optimist. I think this is no better time than now, but I also think we need to get real with ourselves, right, and dig in and make it happen.
Well, it might be what we title your show, Ben. Time to dig in with Ben Stapleton, because I think it's well said and timely.
Awesome. Thank you, brother.
Yeah. How do we, let's make sure we tell our audience how to find you. How do we learn more about USGBC-LA? Tell us the social media. Where can we learn everything about what Ben Stapleton and USGBC-LA is doing?
Just USGBC-LA.org. You can follow us on Instagram or LinkedIn or Facebook, whatever your different handles are. And I would just encourage people to come out, come out for an event. We do a lot of stuff virtually. We do stuff in person as well. We have career fairs. We have other things. So I always say just get engaged and get involved, and everything else will kind of come from there. So I just encourage folks to check us out. We try to make sure that everything we do, you learn something and you also have fun and you also meet someone. And that's kind of the basis for moving things forward. So check us out wherever it makes sense for you, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
And you're in Los Angeles. You're part of the USGBC-LA. It's independent from the USGBC. But for our audience who's out there around the world, I'm sure you'd agree, right? There's USGBC chapters in lots of major cities. If there's not, you can start one. So learn about what USGBC-LA is doing. Learn about what Ben's doing. We hope there's a lot you took from the show. But our message here is to also get active and get involved in your community. And USGBC is a great place to do that.
Thank you, Joel. No, I agree. And I think that there's some place wherever you are, there's a group that you can connect with and start making things happen. So I think that's a great point.
Well, let's end up on that. Thank you, everyone, for joining. You can find us on most of the social media platforms at Join Raven. So that's Join, and Raven is with a Y, RAYVEN. You can find this podcast and more great content at joinraven.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe, like, and share with your friends. And until next time, we encourage you to ask yourself, what are you doing to fight the climate crisis?